once they got his father to the hospital, they took his robe off, and they watched as these entities carved from the inside of the skin out religious amulets. So it was subdermal first, through the skin to the surface. And these amulets were not religiously exclusive, right? It's very interesting. Like for one of them, it's out of what's called the Atrahasis epic. And it talks about how the soul has a constitution to it, a texture, a tangibility to the soul. It says that the soul of a man is made from the flesh of a god.
Hello and welcome to the Spirit Box podcast, where we explore folklore, magic, the world of the spirits, and everything in between. Today we're joined by Nathaniel Gillis. He's a religious demonologist and author, and after living in a haunted house, he spent 20 years researching what he had encountered. He goes through this story in the show today. Nathaniel has sought to redefine the nature of the haunting phenomenon, ghosts and high strangeness. For example, he asked the question, if the abduction phenomena is in fact part of the OBE and NDE family, then maybe we need to re-examine many of the ancient funerary texts. Perhaps it is the abduction experience that shaped their views of the afterlife and the litany of ways they prepared for it. Nathaniel outlines how the Atrahasis epic states, the soul of a man is made from the flesh of a god. This speaks to consciousness being more than a mere thought or memory. This speaks of consciousness actually possessing a texture of some sort. The soul being fleshy is a reference to the tangibility of the apparition and the way it maintains solid form. The hidden potentiality is why he began to call greys and other apparitional manifestations as interdimensional. It's rich territory and interesting food for thought, and an added dimension to the Spirit Box catalogue of interests. Now in the Plus show, Nathaniel goes into some astonishing cases he's personally investigated and helped with, which helped him understand how some of this phenomenon works. We also go into the potency of iron as a protective amulet against this phenomenon. Good stuff indeed. Now, if you'd like to hear the Plus show, then sign up to Patreon and you'll get this show and all the back catalogue of the Plus shows and indeed some bonus extras. If Patreon isn't your thing, which is understandable, then you can always support the show by giving me the old 5 stars or indeed buy me a book. The usual links, all that are in the show notes. Yeah, you guys know how it works. Anyway, let's get into it. Nathaniel Gillis, it is 2.5 years since you were on the
pretty much
Spirit Box. Before it was the Spirit Box, an original OG. So
right.
You're very welcome back.
Thank you very much.
Well, what have you been doing? And introduce yourself to the audience.
So my name's Nathaniel Gillis, and I'm known as a demonologist. That's only because that's where the body of my research is. But I don't know if I should get back to where I started in all this and how I got onto doing all this. So my first experience with the paranormal, it occurred to me when I was eight years old. My family moved into a new house, and even at the open house, they led me into what would become my future room. And just for me walking into the room itself, I was met with a stench. It smelled like death or a corpse. And so my parents left me and said, okay, we're going to go talk to the realtor and kind of poke around and figure out where you're going to place all your stuff in this room. So I'm looking around, I open up the closet and everything. And for some reason, I was led to get on all fours and look underneath the bed. And I don't know why. I'm 33 years old. I still don't understand why I did that. But I did. And when I pulled the blanket up, I was met face to face with a full-bodied apparition. It was a little girl, approximately 6 years old. She had long black hair. She was pale in complexion, was wearing a white linen dress that looked to have been made during the turn of the century. And when we both met each other's gaze, we both kind of recoiled, and she recoiled and shimmied all the way back to the wall. And at that point, I just put the blanket back down and just kind of was like, okay, I'm out of here. Come to find out, it wasn't, a child that belonged to the family that was selling the house. Once I moved into the house, I realized that child, they didn't live on the street. So I started realizing that this may have been a ghost. This may be an entity, and that house may be been haunted. So once we moved into the house itself, it was crazy because the entity mutated. The manifestations evolved into shadow figures, into apparitions that would kind of develop in the room. And it was a very strange phenomenon, but that's really where I got my introduction to this field. Once I grew up and grew into this research, I realized, yes, I was dealing with a malevolent entity. No, that wasn't just a little girl, it wasn't even a ghost of a little girl, even. It was something far more malevolent. And so let me say this, while I was experiencing that and going through that, I was attending a local church, an evangelical church. And before anybody cuts me off, they're going to watch this show, just listen to what I have to say, right? Yeah, so I was going to my pastors, my youth pastor and everything, and said, you know what, I'm experiencing this at my house. Do you have any answer for this? What's really going on? And they didn't really understand what was going on either. It was kind of like they were groping in the darkness, just like I was. And so it wasn't until I grew into this literature of the demonology subject, started realizing that demonology doesn't really have a good grasp of the phenomenon. The phenomenon itself is eclipsing, not microcosm. And I think that being known as a demonologist has helped me, but now I'm trying to transcend that, right? Because my research is transcending that subject itself. But that's how I got to where I am. And it's such an honor to be back on with you, man. It's been a while.
Cool. Thank you for giving us that rundown. And you mentioned there that your work is changing, it's evolving.
Right.
You know, I guess that's a good place to start. So,
Mhm.
to help with that is obviously is what is it changing into, and then
Mhm.
why, what's drawing that out.
The case studies that I've researched, and not just what I found in literature, but in terms of cases that I've had dealing with experiencers of both hauntology and the UFO abduction phenomenon, has led me to believe that we are dealing with entities that their communication has been witnessed by our ancestors. And so we begin to draw images that we saw they used, right? Amulets that they used. And so we try to adapt them into our own religions. One of the key turning points in my own research that really inspired me to grow beyond the one-dimensional thinking of demonology is a remote viewer that I had. And if you follow my Instagram, you've seen this. I post about him a lot. It was a gentleman that contacted me about his father, who was a remote viewer. He had a lot of prophecies that came true, and he would go into trances. He would meet his guides, and they would give him knowledge that he would have never otherwise known. And yet, he said that one day his father stumbled down the stairs. He could barely walk. He was incoherent. He was pale, and he was freaking out. And he had a coronary. He had a heart attack. And he said once they got his father to the hospital, they took his robe off, and they watched as these entities carved from the inside of the skin out religious amulets. So it was subdermal first, through the skin to the surface. And these amulets were not religiously exclusive, right? It wasn't like, okay, they only used the Jewish Star of David, or it wasn't just that they used the cross or Egyptian hieroglyphics, which is, no, it wasn't just, they didn't just use one of those, they used all three of them in unison. And so as a researcher, I'm tempted, obviously, to say, okay, I'm going to stick to dogmatism, because Christianity says these entities should only obey the cross. Judaism says these entities should only obey the Star of David, right? None of this fits the blueprint of modern demonology, even ancient demonology. What this does is does point to these entities eclipsing that dimension of thought and still using these amulets against us in a way that we're still understanding. It was almost as if these amulets were like a mathematical equation to them, right? And so once I realized that, I kind of took all of my understanding of ancient demonology, set it aside, and said that what if that is but a vein of thought? What if that is a form of manifestation that we've witnessed? But what if that's not the entirety? All right. So we cannot define these entities. I know it's, for some people, they're going to watch this and think, okay, that's obvious. Well, it's not that obvious, and so, but that's really one of the key points to my research that led me to believe, okay, that these entities are operating in a dimension that we do have some clarity in. We do see amulets they're using. We understand the purposes, at least in this dimension, but they're using them against us in ways that we're not aware of at this point. So it's larger than demonology, and I think it's even larger than ufology, right? So I think that's what really inspired me to grow deeper in this.
And that's quite a shift, isn't it? Like,
Mhm.
seeing that this is beyond the particular faith.
Right.
And when we think of kind of demonology, and certainly how it's portrayed in, or
Mhm.
demonic possession, how it's
Mhm.
portrayed, particularly by Hollywood, really.
Yeah, it's
Like
amazing.
it fundamentally seems to be like a Catholic
Right.
point of view, or it's a Catholic point of resolution, um,
Mhm.
and that obviously is demonstrably not the case across the world.
Correct. Correct.
Um, you know, original cultures have been dealing with this kind of stuff
Mhm.
since time began. In far
Correct.
more effective ways. One could argue, but
Mhm.
that's a remarkable case you discussed there about the
Mhm.
symbols appearing from kind of like the outside in,
Yes,
inside out.
subliminal
Got
first.
the wrong way. Sorry.
No.
And yeah, yeah, and and I think when we spoke before, and had the odd correspondence, you've mentioned this a lot actually, kind of like writing and symbols appearing on the skin or in the inside of
Mhm.
eyelids, this kind of stuff.
Correct.
Yeah, could you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, so that usually it manifested first in ancient cases of the incubi phenomenon. So if you look into Father Sinastrari's work, he was a Franciscan priest, and he wrote a thesis. It's amazing. It was a short book, but it was on the incubi. And what he was experiencing is he was actually going into case studies in homes within an hour of these entities accosting women specifically. Um, and then they would witness these entities leaving semen samples, and so, and then not just that, but they had cases where the victims would eventually die. And in the autopsy, they would turn the eyelids upside down, and these entities had carved their symbols underneath the eyelids. And even in the Middle Ages, we have a lot of demonologists that were experiencing this phenomenon and having case studies where these entities were carving symbols in the private parts. So whatever was hidden to us on the outside, according to their clothing, right? That's where they would place their symbols, on their victims. So what's very interesting about that is that we did not have witnesses at that period of time that witnessed these symbols being formed. So we do not know if they came from underneath the skin first to the surface. But I will say this, and this is one of the interconnectivities between both phenomena, hauntology and ufology and all that stuff. Uh, the issue is just like I have cases in hauntology where women and men have both been attacked by entities in the house, and they feel an immediate burning sensation, but they see underneath the skin scratches that are the scratches move to the surface. So it leads, at least it does for me in my own work, it leads me to believe that they're scratching something first, and then it's manifesting on our skin second. Now, I'm going to go deep into this. It's very interesting. So this gets into the field of the UFO abduction case studies. Like Betty Luca was one of the experiencers that was pulled out of her body. Her soul was peeled from her body, and these entities captured what we would call her consciousness. And then her case study goes on. It's very interesting. It says that once she got back into her body, then her body began to demonstrate scarifications, symbols, all these different cases. And so I had to conclude that I think it's the same thing, that they're working on the soulless dimension here. And so I believe that whatever they're doing to the soul is manifesting itself on the skin. I'm not saying that we don't have cases where there are what are called they're not just taking pieces of our skin, a piece of our flesh out, what are called punch biopsies. I don't think that's, obviously that's occurring, But I do believe there's a ton of cases where we have people who have been abducted by the soul. They pull the soul out, and then once they put the soul back in, then things begin to manifest on the skin. So once I started getting that kind of behavioral pattern, then I went into biblical antiquity and realized that our interpretation, at least an evangelical interpretation of their version of leprosy, is not accurate. Their version of leprosy goes with the Hebrew term lashon hara, the evil tongue, or what's called false prophecy. They believe that when people would meet this particular species of false prophets, that there was some kind of corpse pollution or some kind of spiritual pollution that would occur, and then it would manifest on the skin. So whatever happened to the soul would manifest on the skin second. Soul first, skin second. And so that's another motif of my research that made me realize that demonology is only valuable when it understands the case studies. In other words, interpreting the phenomenon. It's not valuable to me in the sense where I have to be dogmatic about it and apply scripture in terms of liturgical rites, and you got to believe A, B, and C in order. No. And again, I think that's why a lot of people tend to stay away from demonology, right? But I think that with dealing with symbols, yes, there are case studies that manifest again on the skin second, but the soul first. We even have, and this deals with the afterlife, because we have case studies of Ian Stevenson's when he was dealing with individuals who say they had a previous body, they lived a previous life, and yet now they have death wounds on their flesh from a previous life. So I'm believing that there's some kind of interconnectivity between whatever happens to the soul manifests on the body, at least according to the data sample.
Yeah, no, I've had other guests talk about that in a different context, but I mean, even in even kind of one step removed, where one of my previous guests, the Reverend Danny Nemo, had he had a very serious flesh-eating bacteria infection, one which he treated with natural medicine in Brazil. He consequently had two daughters, and one of them had a birthmark exactly in the place where he had his infection, and he found this astonishing and mentioned it to the shaman who he was working with. Said, yeah, sometimes that happens, and there's often cases of, well, I say often cases, but there's documented accounts of children being born with birthmarks, and as they get older, they
Right.
associate the birthmarks with how they left their previous incarnation, often quite violent.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And even more so, this is a unique perspective too. There's documented cases where the individual, like, they'll know who they used to be. And I know the issue with talking about the subject is the phenomenon is expansive. It's interconnected, right? So you could be talking about UFOs, be talking about something, it's all the same thing. Really, it is. But yeah, so we have case studies where people will tell you their names, they'll tell you what they look like, and then people will literally go pick up a picture. They'll go find and locate that particular individual and say, was this you? Yes, it was. And they look alike. Like, yeah, it's crazy stuff. But it is a profound implication for us as a species, because again, I believe that demonology, in terms of Catholicism, I think it's on the wrong foundation. And I know we're not going into segments, but this is a big segment of research here. See, one of the big issues I had growing up in Christianity was their version of demons. I think that the fallen angel hypothesis is it's contradictory. It makes no sense. You can't be fallen if you're an angel, and if you're an angel, you're not fallen. It's not until we get into Ugaritic texts that we start realizing why the Hebrew mythology interpreted this phenomenon as if it's horns and hooves. And so I think that needs to be said, because when we're dealing with people that say these are not demons, what they're doing is they're saying, without understanding it, these are not the Catholic definition of demons, which I agree, right? But that doesn't mean our ancestors did not have something to say about this. Does that make sense? And when we get into the idea of these entities being demons, we need to realize that we have texts in the Bible that did not originate the Hebrew consciousness. These ideas were retranslated into religion. If we get into Genesis 6 narrative, we get into the Rephaim and all that. Prior to that Rephaim text, those Rephaim texts being written in Genesis, we first found them in ritual bowls. They were written in Ugaritic texts, right? And so the Ugaritic called angels, they called them, what was it? Yeah, Malakuma. And Malakuma to them, it was a divine being, but it was because the divine being was a deceased ancestor. And so they interpreted the angelic presence in the world as being consciousness. Now, so which means if we're dealing with an angelic presence or even a fallen angel, it's important for us at least to perceive this for a moment as consciousness first. And not this Greek mythological image where these entities got their wings cut off, they fell from, and I no disrespect to that, but I think that we have texts that are far ancient than that, that gives us a good foundation instead of us looking back through history retrospectively and saying, I think I know what they believed. Let's ask them what they believed. And so I think that's a good position for us to get into, the idea of demons versus aliens, whether or not we wanted to.
So, I mean, from my perspective, I immediately start thinking fairies and jinn, which I'm prone to do. Interestingly, like there's a lot of components there that have repetition in how people would describe those encounters in folklore, and certainly kind of like the sexual interest in human beings from fairies and jinn, very common. But interestingly, kind of making a substantial ideological leap into kind of the UFO world, where there is the idea of human jinn hybrids, of fairy human hybrids. In fact, a lot of our big famous characters in history have ambiguous parenthood. Certainly Merlin.
Right.
Father was some sort of angelic being or disembodied being. Sauron of Akkad. Sargon. Oh God, Sauron of Akkad. I just watched The Hobbit yesterday. That's the problem.
I was thinking about that.
I've been reading The Hobbit to my kids, and
it's
then
all
I've
good.
been
It's all good.
binging the films.
Yeah.
Sargon of Akkad also kind of claimed jinn parentage, and but even in kind of in like say Irish folklore, like the son of Fionn McCool, Oisin, and Oisin is a significant figure in the sense that he's the link between kind of that kind of like ancient Irish heroic past of the Fenian cycles and kind of the early kind of medieval poetry outlining his achievements and a direct link to Saint Patrick. And in some of the books the early poems are debates between him and Saint Patrick because he's teleported through time from going to fairyland. But interestingly, again, this is a figure who has dubious parentage. Now, I wanted to get into that, and where I'm going with that, so it is essentially kind of your work with ufology and kind of how you tied kind of your understanding and your background and your research in the area of demonology and how that starts to kind of bleed into ufology. Now, what I'm interested in I want to kind of hear obviously that framing that you have, and what I'm really interested in hearing is what are your thoughts on this whole kind of like the idea of like the hybrid.
Right. Yeah.
We have the modern phenomena of that, but actually kind of what I'm saying, this is actually a very, very old idea.
Absolutely.
The latest version of it.
So if we go into the earliest texts, we have consciousness leaving the body. This is this is actually a Phoenician text. It's the mortuary rites more than anything. But the idea was that when somebody died, their consciousness would leave their body and it would become a lil spirit, Lil. And that entity was disembodied, discorporate. It had what I call the disability of being without being, a being. So it's just consciousness, period. It's consciousness everywhere. So what these entities began to do is these lil spirits, the species of creature, was going around and manifesting to men harvesting their seed and then going to a woman and then appearing as a former lover to inseminate them. And so even like the earliest text of vampirology was people witnessing these entities literally through necromantic rituals, reviving the recently deceased body. And as Sinistrari of Amino and Montague Summers both considered it to be milking the carcasses of the dead. And so even like when you get into the descriptions of the seed that was being used in the incubi cases, it was dark green. Sometimes it looked like tar. And again, that's why Summers and a lot of these other demonologists believed that a lot of the seed that these entities were trying to use came from corpses. Very interesting. So one of the connections that really led me to believe these are the same phenomena, again, is the incubi, succubi cases. I mean, if we get into their technology and the way that they manipulate the mind in these case studies, we have cases of women who go into dream states and they can't explain it. I just got tired one day, right? These are just ancient cases. I'll get into mine here in a second. Ancient cases where I just got tired one day and I went into a sleep state and I was induced into this dream and I'm looking at this entity. And at first I thought it was my husband. And the next thing you know, we have intercourse. And at the very end of it, it changes its shape to whatever it really was. And then, and I didn't understand it. To me, it was just a nightmare. That's where the legend comes from, a nightmare. And so they're dream demons, according to demonology, dream demons. Well, what started happening is that we had victims all across the world. It wasn't just a local phenomenon. Victims all across the world who were thinking that what they experienced was fake, right? It wasn't reality. It was just a nightmare. And because of that, this is very interesting too. This gets into their sexual pathology. Because of them not realizing and not believing this was real, they were more apt to give themselves up. Just making sense, right? It's not real anyways. I'll let it occur. This will happen. I'll wake up from it. It's just another nightmare. I'll, get up for work and everything's fine. But what started happening is that these victims were waking up and they would have not just scarifications and symbols, but where the entity had held them down in a dream, they had bruisings and markings on their body that coincided with the actual event that they thought was just a dream. And so that's when we start having cases of these, and I'm going to say this very carefully. Most of your cases dealing with entities that were sexual, it was usually women. That was their pathology. Okay. And that's just what the data suggests. But we're also dealing again with people that were going into these dream states, waking up with bruises and everything. And then they begin to have children from the encounter. And so your earliest demonologists would call this phenomenon, I got to say that, not just the entity, but the entire experience based upon how the entity manifested. If it manifested as a man, it was an incubus. If it manifested as a woman, it's a succubus. But what happened early on is very interesting, is in Hebrew mythology, the Hebrew text suggests, is very good, very interesting. They took the little narrative from Phoenician mythology, remember the consciousness that exists outside of the body. They took that. And again, they're trying to put a face to the phenomenon they're experiencing. So what they said is that there is a little spirit that's going around and it's stealing the seed from men. We're going to call that Lilith, right? So once again, the phenomenon has a measure of consciousness baked into it. And so throughout history, we have Lil spirits and we have Lilith. And there are even male counterparts to the Lilith spirit. But make sure that we have to understand again that the sexual pathology suggests that these entities were manifesting to people according to images they had in their mind. Okay? So in other words, most of the time it was a married woman who, when the husband would leave, the entity would manifest to her in the image of the husband. And then intercourse would occur at the very end of it. Once the deed was done, the entity did not care anymore, could care less. It reverted back to its original apparition, pieced out, it's gone. What it leaves the victim, obviously victimized, But it goes without saying that they didn't understand what happened, because this entity literally stepped into their mind, stretched themselves out into a role, and manipulated the entire situation. It was those particular case studies that evolved into what we would consider to be the modern UFO abduction phenomenon and the hybridization program, where these women were being abducted and they were being impregnated with a species of child. It's very interesting. But so once I realized that that phenomenon has been occurring since millennia, then we need to start to realize, okay, if that's been occurring forever, who are these entities? Are they dead people? You know, what's really going on here? But that was one of my connections that led me to believe they're the same phenomena, they're just wearing different masks.
Yeah, that's really intriguing. And I note that you mentioned, like, are they dead people? And yeah, that's really interesting territory in this field as well, because like, I mean, again, in areas where I have interest in exploring the folklore around fairy and jinn, that kind of stuff. One of the things that happens habitually with people's experiences of being taken to fairyland, so apart from all the stuff of kind of like being under the mountain in slightly cavernous space, you know, and these kind of gentry like palaces where they're with all these fairies having some sort of party, and these parties are always described as being kind of like, you know, wonderful affairs, but they're also laced with some sort of traumatic experience. It's like, you know, kind of like
Right.
you know, they're always have an edge, and people would report seeing dead relatives at the parties in amongst the fairies, which I thought was quite interesting.
It's huge.
Yeah.
That's huge. I mean, if we get into, okay, let's go to the Middle Ages. Let's go to what's called witch era literature, where you know, these witches, and I say that respectfully, they were literally being pulled out of their beds at nighttime, floated out of the window to some mountaintop or some hill, where they think that they're going to have intercourse with a demon. See, this is different masks, same entities, and so this is they're encountering these entities, and it wasn't just demons they thought they were making love to; it was corpses, dead people. So they thought they were committing necrophilia, which, okay, whatever. But their records indicate that during these sessions, that there was some frequency that would fuzz in and out in the program that was being run on them, dissolved in the thin air. And then for a fleeting moment, they're looking around realizing that what they were actually experiencing was nothing like what they were seeing and hearing and understanding with their senses. You know, instead of the corpse and having intercourse with demons and corpses, no, they were being poked and prodded by metallic objects, right? They were being, matter of fact, a lot of these objects were circumcised. Why? Because these entities, again, they were trying to manipulate into where, you know, it feels like that, therefore it must be like that. And then the actual feeling of it was incorporated and it coupled with all the other technology they were using or whatever they were using. It was all a manipulation. It was a program, literally. This is nuts, literally to inseminate. And so again, even in which our literature, we see it's the same phenomenon, but it's wearing a different mask. And that's why it leads me to believe that these entities are no more aliens than they are the classical definition of a demon. I think that they're somewhere in between, because what's more alien to us than death? That soulish dimension that I believe they exist in. But one thing is for sure, the manipulative nature of, if you want me to be a dead person, I'll be a dead person, right? Matter of fact, we have a case study on Dr. Carla Turner's work. She was working with another renowned psychic by the name of Ted Rice. He was abducted with his grandmother. They first tried to copulate with the grandmother by sending a being to her. And she said, I've only been intimate with one man in my lifetime, and that was my husband. So you know what they did? Blink, from the shadows emerges an apparition of her husband. Still looking for some form, not just of consent or whatever we would want to call it, but is there an opening? Like, is there a way? Is there a vulnerability that will allow me to perform what I want to? And so once we realize that, we get a good handle on that, then we go into modern cases where I had a case study in India. It was a single lady who said that this entity, she said that it's manifested to her in the images of every lover she's ever been with. Right. And here's what's interesting. This entity knew who wore protection and who didn't. That's how explicit and how detailed they knew her mind. Literally, to pluck a memory out of the mind and to become whatever that memory suggests. So that, and I think that's obviously a part of the hybridization program.
Right.
But the question is, are they placing consciousness in us?
Mm-hmm.
Or are they placing babies? Or are they using the baby to hatch consciousness that is in it? Right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a reason I asked that. And I know, I think it's a worthy question to ask, but I mean, we have case studies, especially like a Beyond UFOs, academic studies even. Dr. Carla Turner had one case where a lady, she was abducted and they inseminated her and she had a baby and she was pregnant. She told her husband, this fetus will not live.
Right.
It did not. Now, here's what's important. The child did not originate from that union between her and her husband. It originated from her encountering the abduction.
Mm-hmm.
The baby did not make it full term. She knew it. They told her so. Then when she's abducted, they hand her a hybrid child that had the consciousness of the baby she lost in it. So the hybridization program, I think, it's far deeper than just creating a fetus. I believe that it's almost as if I'm creating the fetus because I'm after the consciousness, just like I'm after the consciousness and souls during the abduction phenomenon.
Okay. Yeah, that's a really interesting angle on things. Just to kind of build on what you were saying earlier, certainly in the Scottish witch trials, the accounts that were given by witches who were being persecuted, that comes up again. There's particular figures that come up again, but lots of accounts of familiars, basically saying that they were once alive, they were once people. Some of those relationships also, as you said, becoming sexual, and the reports of some of those sexual encounters saying they were cold, they felt cold.
Correct. Cold to the touch.
Yeah.
You know?
And that's repeatedly there. Like that is in the Scottish records. Turns up again and again. And one of the takes that I've read in folklore again, around the idea of the fairies, and I spoke to this recently, was the fairies for some reason need us for their business, whatever their business might be. You have accounts of fairy women giving birth. Yes, human women are snatched away to wet nurse the child, and so that's interesting as well, because that kind of, you start to unpack that in terms of, well, what is, you mentioned consciousness. I don't know what it is, but is it an energetic sustenance of some description? You have the idea of aliens abducting humans for the idea for their DNA, and there's this whole narrative around they need the DNA to kind of shore up their own stock. I mean, who knows? But it's interesting because I've never heard that reference as you proposed around that they're after the consciousness. That's a really
soulish.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. It's a terrifying hypothesis. And again, we are hypothesizing here, no doubt, right? I don't want people like, oh my God, he thinks he knows it all. No, I'm just, this is my aspect of the research. So again, we do have cases of abduction accounts where people are being pulled out of their bodies. Bob Luca watched Betty Luca as they peeled her soul out. So whatever dimension they're operating in, these entities have a profound knowledge of the afterlife and sense of How does the soul operate out of the body? And I think it goes way beyond what we would consider being taught. I mean, they're not trying to teach us this stuff. You know what I mean? They're not educating the soul in terms of, okay, this is what your soul is. This is what it means. This is what occurred. This is a relationship it has with the body. None of that. What they're doing is strictly, it's a very professional, just kind of a cold nature to it, where I'm going to pull you out, and they'll educate the soul too, right? They've actually had, this is very interesting. People have actually been pulled out of their body, and then their soul has been placed into a chair in the ship. And they said that the chair was made, literally, it was almost tailored or molded according to what their soul had, the constitution, all that. And so when I started realizing that, I started thinking, okay, is it possible that at least my perspective of the soul is different than theirs? I always thought, right, the soul, that was just, some kind of intangible energy. It was no substantive nature to it. It's memories, it's psyche, beliefs, all that. And that's not necessarily the ancient definition of it. And if you start getting into antiquity, you start realizing that a lot of what they're doing incorporates ancient beliefs about the soul, right? It's very interesting. Like, for one of them is it's out of what's called the Atrahasis epic. And it talks about how the soul has a constitution to it, a texture, a tangibility to the soul. It says that the soul of a man is made from the flesh of a god. And so the author kind of couches, right? He pairs them up, but he compares and contrasts. There's a fleshly nature to the soul, and it's made from the flesh of a god. And so in my work, that's what we would call apparitional theory. What is an apparition? Because if we are in fact dealing with the same entities here, the same entities that are haunting houses are the same entities that are abducting people, then we have a great deal of literature that we can go back to and say, okay, what do we have in hauntology about apparitional entities? Well, we just so happen to have entities that have the same characteristics as these entities. In other words, they can walk through a wall and then materialize to the touch. We would consider that an apparitional entity. And so if these entities are operating in that apparitional dimension with that knowledge that the soul does have a constitution to it, there is a constitution of consciousness, that would make perfect sense as to why they would abduct that portion of our potentiality, right? And then start educating that and start molding that into whatever they would want us to be. So if these are entities that are deceased people, and it does seem as if they're operating in an ancient framework here, then we have to go into necromantic rituals. One of the necromantic rituals that was all over Mesopotamia, it was called terraphim, where people would go out and they would dig up a corpse. Usually it was somebody who was recently deceased. They would take it to their house. They would take a small piece of metal. They would carve the name of an unclean spirit, its consciousness, Tumaruah. Ruach meaning that someone who breathes, who inhaled life through the nostrils. It's a creation narrative out of Genesis. Consonants. But yeah, then they would carve that name into the metallic image or metallic implant and implant that into the body. And they believe the consciousness of that deceased ancestor would merge with the metal. And then once placed into that person's body, would then possess them, to where now that ancestor is looking through the eyes of the individual. Well, we do have cases in ufology where people have those implants in them, and the implant itself is alive. Not only that, but when they try to dissect it and pull it out, it moves under the skin away from the doctors. Moving forward, we have another, like I was just looking at Chris Bledsoe's case. We have abductees that when they step on the ship, they say a soul is inside the ship. It's merged with the metal in the sense that the metal itself has consciousness and it has memories. And so I do believe that if we get into necromantic rituals and biblical antiquity, Mesopotamia, a lot of this technology is not new. It's ancient. And so they're employing the same things. It's just we have to realize that, okay, we first hear of this through mortuary rites and ancient necromancy, which would also play into why that they're dealing in the afterlife, right? It all makes sense to me, but I'm not saying that I have, answers for everything, but it does make a little bit more sense.
I mean, I can see where you're getting with it, and how it starts to hang together, and I think like I think we have to challenge ourselves in trying to kind of
Right.
what are the motivations of these
Right.
entities that we're in relationship with,
Mhm.
and as you rightly said, none of us have the answers to that,
Right.
and I think this is why kind of all avenues of exploration are on the table,
Absolutely.
because our comprehension is severely limited to our kind of material, most of us to our material senses,
Mhm.
and the confines of our societal experiences, our cultural experiences, our individual, prisms that we look at life through. Hugely.
Mhm.
So it's important territory that we do look at all these angles, and
Correct.
I mean that it's and some of the stuff you're talking about around kind of like the idea of perception being plucked from consciousness,
Right.
I mean that happens again and again. It's like
Mhm.
we have entities that exhibit the same behavior in different countries. They're totally different
Mhm.
cultures. Yet,
Right.
for some reason, fairies will appear in Ireland with pointed hats, buckles in their shoes,
Mhm. Mhm.
and look like kind of a 16th century peasant.
Mhm.
That's they'll have that kind of perspective. Same as the banshee will when people have seen the banshee, they're dressed in an archaic way, but it's an
Mhm.
archaic way that's culturally relevant. And equally,
Correct.
people who witness the jinn, you know, and behave in very similar ways to fairies,
Mhm.
they're appearing in a way that's culturally relevant and culture and geographically appropriate
Right.
because they're using symbology that means something to the individual who's seeing them.
Mhm.
There was a gentleman called Peter Mark Adams who was on the show recently, and he discussed this in terms of a healer, and discuss
Mhm.
this in terms of like how entities are interacting with us, and said we're an open book to them,
Mhm.
like we're an open book. So it's like our memories, our fears, our desires are all there, and it can be used to manipulate us for whatever reason, whatever business that is,
Mhm.
and interestingly, he has an account where he discusses a man who came to him for treatment. I can't remember the specifics of the treatment, whether it was kind of depression or some other physical ailment as well, and described these dreams that he was having, these encounters with these sexual encounters in his dreams with a beautiful woman, um, and went through some process of kind of unpacking this, and saw that the actual beautiful woman was an illusion, and it was a fly type figure. Like it looked like
Mhm.
a large version of a fly, and that fly was actually impregnating the individual with these energetic eggs, black eggs that were
Mhm.
hanging off the individual's body in the dream state, or
Mhm.
which then hatched, and kind of when he was going through a healing, these things hatched and kind of took off and were pulled off him.
Mhm.
Um, you know, um, I mean, you know,
That's wild, ain't
fuck me.
it?
I mean that's
Yeah. Yeah.
when you start to kind of marry this kind of stuff with the stuff you're proposing, you can see the similarities. You know,
Mhm.
like
Mhm.
it's very very similar territory.
Yeah. The interconnectivities are loud in many ways. The idea that they're wearing different masks, it makes sense. I was talking to Steve Mayer about this, and his work is unparalleled in my reason, according to me. I mean, at least in my perspective, he's amazing. He's like an idol, obviously. Definitely a fanboy. But yeah, he had a case just like I did, where they carved things into the skin of an individual, and this individual died because of it. Like they really messed with the individual. Anyways, they're wearing different masks, and I think a lot of times you're exactly right, where it's culturally relevant. Someone we would believe in, someone that's an authority figure, just like your abductees who call on Jesus and they manifest Jesus. One thing I noticed that's both troubling and intriguing is that the Jesus they manifested was not the historically accurate. Even if people don't believe Jesus existed, it doesn't matter. It's hard to pick up a book where it wasn't Yeshua or it wasn't a Jewish rabbi. right? But they didn't produce the Jewish rabbi version. They produced the Swedish Presbyterian version of Jesus that never existed, but only existed in the mind of the person who perceived Jesus to be a white guy, right? So it's not that they're trying to deceive us to give us truth. No, right? They're just playing a role that we're giving them in the sense of, okay, I'm not, because, what are the chances I'm going to manifest as the real Jesus? You're not going to understand me as that. You're not even going to believe I'm that individual. So I'm going to be whatever you believe him to be. And again, this also falls into them, um, what is it? Weaponizing our beliefs against us. Like if you get into the Apocryphon of John, it's a commentary on Genesis 6. And the reason I gave everybody the caveat that yes, I grew up in evangelicalism, but I don't agree with a lot of their theories, it's because I think that a lot of the researchers that research Nephilim and have an evangelical background, it's filtered through the Western understanding. It's not very Eastern. And so if you get into the Eastern texts, you get into Egypt, you have what's called the Coptic manuscripts. One's, on the Nephilim. It's called the Apocryphon of John, but it's an ancient commentary on the events in Genesis 6. And it's said that these entities, as far back as late Iron Age, they were manifesting to women in the images of their lovers, in the images of their husbands. And so again, I think that what has to happen in the field of ufology is that we have to grow ourselves into new dimensions of thought. We can't just say, like a lot of other researchers, okay, this phenomenon started in the 1960s. It did not. It did not. And so if we look at the bloody footprints in the snow, we see that the sexual pathologies never changed, right? They are always stealing seed and then inseminating it. Now, they may manifest as different people to different people, but the object of their desire is the same. I'm going to inseminate. I have cases right now where women were being visited by these entities, and they tried everything they could to get these entities to stop taking them, to stop abducting them, stop touching them at nighttime, and nothing worked. And then one day, because they started having some issues and some gynecological problems, they get a hysterectomy, not realizing that these two issues are connected throughout history. And then the entities come back. Not. Here we are again. We're going to do the same program. We're going to try to inseminate you. And then they realized after inspecting, hey, we can't do that. We cannot procreate or replicate through this body. And so the phenomenon stopped. So what this does, though, is it couches this argument of moral relevance in what's called moralism. It just dissolves all of that, because the ancient understanding of demons was, okay, why would they have intercourse with women, right? Was it because they're lustful? And even the ancient demonologists said, okay, well, if they were having intercourse with women, what kind of sin would that be, right? What is the it they're having intercourse with? Number one. Number two, how can a virgin become a father? Because they're having intercourse with these entities or whatever. Not just that, they're being worked like in terms of a program where they're taking the seed, creating children, and then bringing them back to virgins. It's very interesting what they're doing, but these are not new questions. And I think that the field of ufology needs to start asking these questions, just like demonologists have, because we had to encounter these case studies as well.
That's intriguing, and you've just made me think of some other kind of like analogs to this,
Yeah.
which I'm really enjoying. Is I had a guest on the show last year, Dr. Maria Voivod, and she did a lot of work with Serbian fairy seers, particularly the Vash people, and it's a living tradition, which is remarkable. But it gives the accounts of these women who are called kind of those who fall, and they fall down, they lose consciousness, and they develop a relationship with what they call their sisters, which are often kind of three beautiful fairy women who start to develop a relationship, develop prophecy. Now, on these particular days of the year, which tend to align with the Orthodox Christian calendar, people come from the local area to visit the fairy seers, and she'll do 2 rounds of prophecy, or communication rather. Then she sings them down, then kind of goes into kind of a trance state or a communicative state, The first thing she'll do is she'll communicate messages from dead ancestors. Right? The second thing she'll do is communicate from the fairy entities.
Mhm.
That the Dr. Voivod had some remarkable encounters with some like absolutely bang on the target information, and then some just
Mhm.
weird stuff that didn't kind of add up, but stuff
Mhm.
that was like extraordinarily accurate. Um, but here's the interesting part, just in
Mhm.
reference to what you're saying. This only occurs um, where after women have had or young women have had their first period, and it stops after they have their go through menopause. So
Mhm.
it only happens during this period of the women's lives,
Mhm.
which directly ties to kind of the example you're giving.
Absolutely, it does. And I think that again, like you said, it's in order to get a better grasp on this phenomenon, look at all aspects of it, right? And it's very interesting. The biological aspect cannot be ignored. Again, when you get into these, like the individuals that reached out to me, once they stopped having, right? I can't reproduce, then their interest stopped.
Mm-hmm.
Now getting into this idea of where are they getting their information from regarding these deceased people, right? And this is a little bit of a different subject, but it gets into the aspect of okay, these entities having access to the dead or being the dead in and of themselves. There's abductees that the way they communicate to these entities is by communicating through necromancy to their ancestors. And so, like you said, sometimes they'll get prophecies that are true, words of knowledge or whatever, discern that that's true. And then they'll get some prophecies that are just way, way, way off. Now, this is a particularly interesting narrative. This is something that Dr. Carla Turner mentions in her work, where you can have these entities who would be so profoundly knowledgeable, like you couldn't have been more accurate. There was no way they would have ever gotten this information. And yet, in the same moment, they would suggest something to you, give you a prophecy, and in 50, 70, 100 years, never occurred.
Mm.
And so here's the question. How can you have that much profound knowledge and know that you need to communicate this and know that once you do, I'll understand it.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the same breath, tell me something that's never happened and will never happen.
Mm.
Stuff that it doesn't make sense. So it's either that they have access to information and they're just trying to deceive us, or they literally are seeing something that's never going to occur.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to believe that it's manipulation.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to give you truth, and then I'm going to give you a lie.
Mm-hmm.
And so we don't know why they're doing it, but it's inconsistent all across the board.
Mm-hmm.
Like Ted Rice was inconsistent with his readings. I still have some of the prophecies that this remote viewer gave from these entities. Some of it was right on. Others were, like here's the date and time.
Yeah.
Never happened. So how can they be that knowledgeable and that wrong at the same time? Makes no sense.
Yeah. Well, I have some thoughts on this as well. Is that
Mhm.
first off, I think like spirits lie, you know, all the time.
Yeah.
That's for their own manipulation, whatever that is. The second thing is that I don't think they perceive time the same way as we do.
Mhm.
Which I think is quite relevant.
Right.
I've certainly some experiences that I've had where things that happened, say, 20, 30 years ago have
Mhm.
just popped up, in recent weeks through spirit communication. And it's like, and then that makes sense now. But it's a 30-year
Mhm.
gap to,
Right. Like that.
yeah. So it's, and there's accounts like that all the time, around like these
Mhm.
massive gaps. Time, we perceive linear time, and I
Mhm.
hazard a guess that entities that we're engaging with do not.
Correct. I believe that. I believe that 100%. That's a good point you made. And this gets into some very interesting aspects of my work too. There was a researcher by the name of Ray Fowler, and he was the primary researcher that worked with Betty and Babaluka. And he wrote a book on her about their connections with the species, and it's really interesting. He came out with a very interesting point. He noted the similarities abductions have with near death experiences, and how that in near death experiences the body stays here, but it seems like the soul that hidden potentiality within all of us transcends and goes to a different world, a different dimension, and they meet ancestors, right? And these ancestors will give them prophecies. This is what's going to happen to you, and you're not supposed to be here at this time. And what's very interesting too is that just as abduction accounts vary, so does near-death experiences. Outside of us, outside of people encountering deceased relatives, a lot of this stuff is just almost like it does it. There's no kind of pattern there that could solidify a real dimension or reality that's consistent. You know what I mean? There were similarities in terms of where people, when they were out of their body, they felt what they call an intelligent electricity, suck their soul into this dimension, then they encounter these entities. But that's not unlike, again, the abduction accounts, where these people are being pulled out of their body, and it's the same environment, same experience. And it may be their perception, So I do believe, again, we're still on the knife's edge of these entities being consciousness, right? So that's where I'm at now.
Brilliant. Fascinating stuff. Really fascinating stuff. Well, if anybody wants to find out more about your work, or indeed pick up some of your material, what's the best way for them to do so?
Okay, I do not have a website anymore. I think it's just easier to be on social media anyways. But you can find me on YouTube under Nathaniel J. Gillis. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram under Nathaniel J. Gillis. And as you know, I update my Instagram about once or twice a week with my research, say, this is what I'm thinking about. And then after that, I'll go to my YouTube channel and I'll expound on that for like an hour-long deal. That's how to find me. And again, guys, I'm not saying I have all the answers. What I'm saying, again, is that in order to understand this phenomenon, the ancient texts, they have a lot to say.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really interesting view on things. And I really enjoyed the last kind of hour and a half or so discussing these areas with you. I think you've got some truly interesting research, and it really adds to the conversation.
Appreciate that.
I think that's all we can ask, right? Is how are we adding to the conversation as researchers and people exploring these areas, and so I'm very grateful for the work that you've done and presented to us today.
Thank you.
So, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on, man. It's been a pleasure.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you. Thank you, Nathaniel. Really interesting stuff. I hope you all enjoyed that. The show notes are below, so do feel free to follow up and check out more of Nathaniel's work. He's very widely featured on paranormal podcasts, so I'm sure you'll find his work quite easily. Right, that's it from me. Thank you very much. I'm Darren Mason, and you've been listening to The Spirit Box. Take care and bye.